Hey, Get Trapped, how you doing, bro? Thanks for stopping by.
Part 1 of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Bob Newton. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. Part 1. Story of the Door. Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, was a man of a rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile. Cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse, backward in sentiment, lean, long, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. At friendly meetings, and when the wine was to his taste, something eminently human beaconed from his eye. Something indeed which never found its way into his talk, but which spoke not only in these silent symbols of the after-dinner face, but more often and loudly in the acts of his life. He was austere with himself, drank gin when he was alone to mortify a taste for vintages, and though he enjoyed the theater, had not crossed the door.
Hey, Mix, how you doing, bro? Thanks for stopping by.
Had an approved tolerance for others, sometimes wondering, almost with envy, at the high pressure of spirits involved in their misdeeds, and in any extremity inclined to help rather than to reprove. I incline to Cain's heresy, he used to say quaintly. I let my brother go to the devil in his own way. In this character, it was frequently his fortune to be the last reputable
Have a good night.
and the last good influence in the lives of
I did a little live.
And to such as
Listen to a book and
they came about his chambers,
smoke some bubble hash.
marked a shade of change in his demeanor. No doubt the feat was easy to Mr. Utterson, for he was undemonstrative at the best, and even his friendship seemed to be founded in a similar...
That's a mix of mine and my brother's past harvests.
To accept his friendly circle ready-made,
saved it up to
and that was the
make some bubble hash till we got enough.
His friends were those of his own blood, or those whom he had
that
known
one.
His affections,
a little piece so I can get it
with
out.
the growth of time. They implied no aptness in the object. Hence, no doubt, the bond that united him to Mr. Richard Enfield, his distant kinsman, the well-known man about town. It was a nut to crack for many what these two could see in each other, or what subject they could find in common. It was reported by those who encountered them in their Sunday walks that they said nothing, looked singularly dull, and would hail with obvious relief the appearance of a...
Oh no, I had to go down to it.
But the greatest store by these...
On my brother's you were.
The chief jewel of each week.
There we go.
And not only set aside occasions of pleasure, but even resisted the calls of business.
Well, now you got a jacket, bro.
It chanced on one of these rambles that their way led them down a by street in a busy quarter.
Yeah, mine's a little bit different from my brother. My brother, we put a lot of music on when we do ours, but on mine, I like listening to books or reading books, so I'll put a book on.
And laying out the surplus of their graves in coquetry, so that the shop fronts stood along that thoroughfare with an air of invitation, like rows of smiling saleswomen. Even on Sunday, when it veiled its more florid charms and lay comparatively empty of
oh shit, that sucks, Get Trapped.
Shone out in contrast to its dingy neighborhood like a fire in a forest, and with its freshly painted shutters, well-polished brasses, and general cleanliness and gaiety of note, instantly caught and pleased in the eye of the passenger. Two doors on one corner on the left-hand side. The line was broken by the entrance.
Yeah, you dirty.
And just at that point, a certain
How you doing, bro?
Building thrust forward its gable on the street. It was 2 stories high, showed no window, nothing but a door on the lower story and a blind 4-headed discolored wall on the upper, and bore in every feature the mark of prolonged and sordid negligence. The door, which was equipped with neither bell nor knocker, was blistered and disdained. Tramps slouched into the recess and struck matches on the panels. Children kept shop under the steps. The schoolboy had tried his
Hey,
knife
T-Bird,
on
how
the
you
board,
doing?
and for close on a generation, no
Thanks for
one
stopping
had
by.
appeared to drive away these random visitors or to repair their ravages. Mr. Enfield and the lawyer were on the other side of the by-street, but when they came abreast of the entry, the former lifted up his cane and pointed. "Did you ever remark that door?" he asked, and when his companion had replied in the affirmative, "It is connected in my mind," added he, "with a very odd story." "Indeed?" said Mr. Hutchinson, with a slight change of voice.
Hope everyone's doing good today.
"And what was that?" "Well, it was this way," returned Mr. Enfield. "I was coming home from some place at the end of the world about 3 o'clock of a black winter morning, and my way lay through a part of town where there was literally nothing to be seen but lamps. Street after street, and all the folks asleep. Street
What is it? No problem. I'm glad you liked them. Hey, Ozark, how you doing, bro? Put some Lovecraft on.
H.P. Lovecraft. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org.
I haven't put nothing on just yet, but I'm more than likely gonna put some
English horror.
Diablo on. I've been doing a lot of grinding on
Gorgons and
Diablo 3 because
stories of Selena.
they have a season going
They
on,
reproduce themselves in the brain of superstition.
and you get special weapons and gear for completing certain parts of the season. And then I've been doing a lot of grinding too on Diablo 2. They came out with the resurrection, or resurrected one of it.
Considered in the capacity of being able to inflict upon his bodily injury. Oh, least of all, these terrors are overstated.
On both my other accounts on Diablo 3, I've pretty much got all the gear I wanted for 2 of the characters I have, or 2 of my characters anyways. So I've been doing a lot of work on Diablo 3, Diablo 2.
The solution of which might afford some palpable insight into our anti-mundane condition, and a peep at least into the shadow realm of pre-existence. Charles Lamb, Witches and Other Night Horrors. 1. When a traveler in north-central Massachusetts takes the wrong fork of the
I gotta be careful on the Diablos, because if I'm not careful, I'll be pulling all-nighters on that. And
as closer
just try to do a couple things, and before I know it,
dusty, curving
a
road.
couple hours have
The
passed.
trees of the Freeford Forest Park seem too large, and the wild weeds, brambles, and grasses obtain a luxuriance not often found in settled regions. At the same time, the planted fields appear singularly.
It sucks how that happens on certain games.
The sparsely scattered houses bear a surprising uniform aspect of age, squalor, and dilapidation. Without knowing why, one hesitates to ask directions from their gnarled,
Spend that much on it, and it still feels like you didn't get much done.
Those figures are so silent and furtive that one feels somehow confronted by forbidden things with which it would be better to have nothing to do. When rising road brings the mountains in view above the deep woods, the feeling of strange uneasiness is increased. The summits are too rounded and symmetrical to give a sense of comfort and naturalness, and sometimes the sky silhouettes with especial clearness the clear circles of tall stone pillars with which most of them are crowned. Gorges and ravines of problematical depth intersect the way, and the crude wooden bridges always seem of dubious safety. When the road dips again, there are stretches of marshland that one instinctively dislikes, and indeed almost fears at evening when unseen whippoorwills chatter and the fireflies come out in abnormal profusion to dance to the raucous, creepily insistent rhythms of stridently pegging bullfrogs. The thin, shining line of the Miskatonic's upper reaches has an oddly serpent-like suggestion as it winds close to the feet of the domed hills among which it rises. As the hills draw nearer, one heeds their sides more than their stone-crowned tops. Both sides loom up so darkly and precipitously that one wishes they would keep their distance, but there is no road by which to escape them. Across a covered bridge, one sees a small village huddled between the stream and the vertical slope of Round Mountain, and wonders at the cluster of rotting gambrel roofs, bespeaking an earlier architectural period than that of the neighboring region. It is not reassuring to see, on a closer glance, that most of the houses are deserted and falling to ruin, and that the broken steepled church now harbors the one slovenly mercantile establishment of the county. One dreads to trust the tenebrous tunnel of the bridge, yet there is no way to avoid it. Once across, it is hard to prevent the impression of a faint, malign odor about the village street, as of the amassed mold and decay of centuries. It is always a relief to get clear of the place, and to follow the narrow road around the base of the hills and across the level country beyond till it rejoins the Aylesbury Pike. Afterward, one sometimes learns that one has been through Dunwich. Outsiders visit Dunwich as seldom as possible, and since a certain season of horror, all the signboards pointing toward it have been taken down. The scenery, judged by any ordinary aesthetic can, is more than commonly beautiful, yet there is no influx of artists or summer tourists. 2 centuries ago, when talk of witch blood, Satan worship, and strange forest presences was not laughed at, it was the custom to give reasons for avoiding the locality. In our sensible age, since the Dunwich horror of 1928 was hushed up by those who had the towns and the world's welfare at heart.
Oh yeah, definitely appreciate the support, T-Bird.
Perhaps one reason, though it cannot apply to uninformed strangers, is that the neighbors...
1 second, I think the dogs are
having run far along the path
fucking around real quick.
so common in many New England backwaters. They have come to hold a race by themselves, with their well-defined mental and physical stigmata of degeneracy and inbreeding. The average of their intelligence is woefully low, whilst their annals reek of overt viciousness and of half-hidden murders, incests, and deeds of almost unnameable violence and perversity. The old gentry, representing the 2 or 3 omnivorous families which came from Salem in 1692, have hit somewhat above the general level of decay. Many branches are sunk into the soul populace so deeply that only the means
This was a troublemaker.
the origin and disgrace. Some of the Whateleys and bishops still send their eldest sons to Harvard and Episcopalian, though those sons seldom return to the moldering gamble roots under which they and their ancestors were born. No one, even those who have the facts concerning the recent horror, can say just what is the matter with Dunwich. Though old legends speak of unhallowed rites,
Yeah, the dogs are in there wrestling around each other, and that little one picks on the bigger one.
Out of the great rounded hills.
She's a little bully sometimes, but he does good with her. He doesn't play rough with her and or whatnot. So
newly come to the Congregational Church at Dunwich Village, preached a memorable sermon on the close presence of Satan and his imps, in which he said, "It must be allowed that these blasphemies of an infernal train of demons are matters of too common knowledge to be denied. The cursed voices of Azazel and Buzrael, of Beelzebub and Belial, being heard from underground by above, a score of credible witnesses now living. I myself did not more than a fortnight ago catch a very plain discourse of evil powers in the hill behind my house, wherein there were a rattling and rolling, groaning, screeching, and hissing.
yeah, she's a cool one.
This earth could raise up, which must needs have come from those caves that only black magic can discover.
Although sometimes she acts like she bigger than what she is,
Mr. Hoadley disappeared
because we got new neighbors now, and
but the text
they got a real pretty little pit over there. And every time it comes out, the other dogs don't bark at her or whatnot, but Ava, when she goes out there, she runs out there, starts barking at her like she's a big old dog, and she's as big as that dog's head.
At the bottom of the great ravines, while still others try to explain the devil's hop yard, the blasted hillside.
That's funny, they're not.
Shrub or grass blade will grow. Then, too, the natives are mortally afraid of the numerous whippoorwills which grow vocal on warm nights. It is vowed that the birds are psychopomps, lying in wait for the souls of the dying, and that they time their eerie cries in unison with the sufferer struggling. If the fleeing soul that leaves the body, they instantly flutter away shivering in demon-night laughter. But if they subside gradually into a disappointed silence. These tales, of course, are obsolete and ridiculous, because they come down from very old times. Dunwich is indeed ridiculously old, older by far than any of the communities within 30 miles of it. South of the village, one may still spy the cellar walls and chimney of the ancient bishop house, which was built before 1700, whilst the ruins of the mill at the falls, built in 1806, form the most modern piece of architecture to be seen. Industry did not flourish here, and the 19th century factory movement proved short-lived. Oldest of all are the great rings of rock-hewn stone columns on the hilltops, but these are more generally attributed to the Indians than to the settlers. Deposits of skulls and bones found within these
Oh, yeah, T-Bird.
around a sizable table of Sentinel Hill sustained the popular belief that such spots were once the burial places of the Bukumkas.
Yeah, her and my brother's dog Damien both have what's been called little shirts that they have.
It was in the township of Dunwich, in a large and partly inhabited farmhouse set against a hillside 4 miles from the village and a mile and a half from any other dwelling, that Wilbur Whately was born at 5 a.m. on Sunday, the 2nd of February, 1913. This date was recalled because it was Candlemas, which people in Dunwich curiously observe under another name, and because the noises in the hills had sounded, and all the dogs of the countryside had barked persistently throughout the night before. Less worthy of notice was the fact that the mother was one of the decadent Whateleys, a somewhat deformed and unattractive albino woman of 35, living with an aged and half-insane father, about whom the most frightful tales of wizardry had been whispered in his youth. Lavinia Whately had no known husband, but according to the custom of the region, made no attempt to disavow the child. Concerning the other side of
Hey,
Benjamin's
Shots
history,
Prospecting, how you
both
doing?
might and did speculate as widely as they
Hell
chose.
yeah, it's all good.
On the contrary, she seemed strangely proud of her dark, goatish-looking infant, who formed such a contrast to her own sickly and pig-like albinism, and was heard to mutter many curious prophecies.
Yeah, that's
about
how,
its unusual powers and
my brother's dog Damien and
Lavinia
Ava
was
are
one
too right
who
now.
to mutter such
She's just
things.
cooling down just a little bit. They're starting to shiver all the time.
And trying to read the great odorous books which her father had inherited through 2 centuries of Whately's, which were fast falling to pieces with age and
Hell yeah, that's badass. You have little hats for him too.
Went to school, but was filled with disjointed scraps of ancient lore that old Whately had taught her. The old farmhouse had always been feared because of old Whately's
Have matching
reputation for
outfits.
black magic, and the unexplained death by violence of Mrs. Whately when Lavinia was 12 years old had not helped to make the place popular. Isolated among strange influences, Lavinia was fond of wild and grandiose daydreams and singular occupations, nor was her leisure much taken up by household cares in a home from which all standards of order and cleanliness had long since disappeared. There was a hideous screaming which echoed above even the hill noises and the dogs barking when the night Wilbur was born, but no known doctor or midwife presided at his coming. Neighbors knew nothing of him till a week afterward, when old Whately drove his sleigh through the snow into Dunwich village, and discoursed incoherently to the group of loungers at Osborne's general store. There seemed to be a change in the old man, an added element of furtiveness in the clouded brain which subtly transformed him from an object to a subject of fear, though he was not one to be perturbed by it.
Hell yeah, T-Bird. You have a good evening. Safe
Most of all,
Friday
to show
night,
some
bro.
trace of the pride later noticed in his daughter.
Definitely appreciate you stopping by.
His paternity was remembered by many of his hearers years afterward. I don't care what folks think. If Lavinia's boy looked like his pa, he wouldn't look like nothing you expect. You needn't think the only folks that the
What?
folks hereabouts. Lavinia's read some, and have seen some things the most you only tell about.
I'm gonna go outside. Is that what it is?
Her man is a
Let's go.
he could find on
Whoa.
the side of Aylesbury.
Be right back.
And if you know
Gotta
as
let
much
the dogs
about
outside
them
real
as I
quick.
do, you wouldn't ask no better church London nor Hearn. Let me tell you something. Someday, you folks will hear a child of Lavinia's calling his father's name on the top of Sentinel Hill. The only persons who saw Wilbur during the first month of his life were old Zechariah Whately of the undecayed Whateleys and Earl Sawyer's common-law wife, Mamie Bishop. Mamie's visit was frankly one of curiosity, and her subsequent tales did justice to her observations. But Zechariah came to lead a pair of Alderney cows which old Whately had bought of his son Curtis. This marked the beginning of a course of cattle buying on the part of small Wilbur's family, which ended only in 1928, when the Dunwich horror came and went. Yet at no time did the ramshackle Whately
They all wanted to go
seem
outside this time.
with livestock. There came a period when people were curious enough to steal up and count the herd
Hey,
that
get
grazed
that
precariously
trim,
on the steep
huh?
hillside above the old farmhouse. And they could never find more than 10 or 12 anemic, bloodless-looking specimens. Evidently, some blights or distemper, perhaps sprung from the unwholesome pasturage or the diseased fungi and tingers of the filthy barn, caused a heavy mortality amongst the Whately animals. Odd wounds or sores, having something of the aspect of incisions, seemed to afflict the visible cattle. And once or twice during the earlier months, certain callers fancied they could discern similar sores about the throats of their grave, unshaven old man and his slatternly, crinkly-haired albino daughter. In the spring after Wilbur's birth, Lavinia resumed her customary rambles in the hills, bearing in her misproportioned arms a swarthy child. Public interest in the Whately subsided after most of the country folk had seen the baby, and no one bothered to comment on the swift development which that newcomer seemed every day to exhibit. Wilbur's growth was indeed phenomenal, for within 3 months of his birth, he had attained a size and muscular power not usually found in infants under a full year of age. His motions, and even his vocal sounds, showed a restraint and deliberateness highly peculiar in an infant. No one was really unprepared when, at 7 months, he began to walk unassisted, with falterings which another month was sufficient to remove.
Hey, Triple B's
It was
Farm, how
somewhat
you
after
doing?
this time, on Halloween, that a
Hope you have a
great
good
blaze
night
was seen
too,
at
bro.
midnight on the top of Sentinel Hill, where the old table-like stone stands amidst its tumulus of ancient bones. Considerable talk was started when Silas Bishop, of the undecayed bishops, mentioned having seen the boy running sturdily up that hill ahead of his mother about an hour before the blaze was remarked. Silas was rounding up a stray heifer, but he nearly forgot his mission when he fleetingly spied the two figures in the dim light of his lantern. They darted almost noiselessly through the underbrush, and the astonished watcher seemed to think they were entirely unclothed. Afterward, he could not be sure about the boy, who may have had some kind of fringed belt with a pair of dark blue trunks or trousers. Wilbur was never subsequently seen alive and conscious without complete and tightly buttoned attire, the disarrangement or threatened disarrangement of which always seemed to fill him with anger and alarm. Its contrast with
That
his
little one
squalid
barking
mother
out there
and
again.
grandfather in this respect was thought very notable until the horror of 1928 suggested the most valid of reasons. The next January, gossips were mildly interested in the fact that LeVay's black brat had commenced to talk, and at the age of only 11 months. His speech was somewhat remarkable, both because of its difference from the ordinary accents of the region, and because it displayed a freedom from infantile lisping of which many children of 3 or 4 were proud. He was more talkative, yet when he spoke, he seemed to reflect some elusive element wholly unpossessed by Dunwich and its denizens. The strangeness did not reside in what he said, or even in the simple idioms he used, but seemed vaguely linked with his intonation or with the internal organs that produced the spoken sounds. His facial aspect, too, was remarkable for its maturity, for though he shared his mother's and grandfather's chinlessness, his firm and precociously shaped nose, united with the expression on his large, dark, almost Latin eyes, to give him an air of quasi-adulthood, well-nigh preternatural intelligence. He was, however, exceedingly ugly, despite his appearance of brilliancy, there being something almost goatish or animalistic about his thick lips, large, pored, yellowish skin, coarse, crinkly hair, and oddly elongated ears. He was soon disliked even more decidedly than his mother and grandsire, and all conjectures about him were spiced with references to the bygone magic of old Whately, and how the hills once shook when he shrieked the dreadful name of Yog Sothoth in the midst of a circle of stones with a great brook open in his arms before him. Dogs abhorred the boy, and he was always obliged to take various defensive measures against their barking menace. 3. Meanwhile, old Whately continued to buy cattle without measurably increasing the size of his herd. He also cut timber and began to repair the unused parts of his house, a spacious, peak-roofed affair whose rear end was buried entirely in the rocky hillside, and whose 3 least-ruined ground-floor rooms had always been sufficient for himself and his daughter. There must have been prodigious reserves of strength in the old man to enable him to accomplish so much hard labor, and though he still babbled dementedly at times, his carpentry seemed to show the effects of sound calculation.
Had to go let the dogs back in.
As soon as Wilbur was born, one of the many tool sheds had been put suddenly in order, clapboarded and fitted with a stout, fresh lock. Now, in restoring the abandoned upper story of the house, he was a no less thorough craftsman. His mania showed itself only in his tight boarding up of all the windows in the reclaimed section, though less inexplicable was his fitting up of another downstairs room for his new grandson, a room which several callers saw, though no one was ever admitted to the closely boarded upper story. This chamber he lined with tall, firm shelving, along which he began gradually to arrange, in apparently careful order, all the rotting ancient books and parts of books which, during his own day, had been heaped promiscuously in odd corners of the various rooms. "I made some use of them," he would say as he tried to mend a torn black-letter page with paste prepared on the rusty kitchen stove. "But the boy's fitting to make better use of them. He'd oughter have them as well side as he can, or they're going to be all of his learning." When Wilbur was a year and 7 months old, in September of 1914, his size and accomplishments were almost alarming. He had grown as large as a child of 4, and was a fluent and incredibly intelligent talker. He ran freely about the fields and hills, and accompanied his mother on all her wanderings. At home, he would pore diligently over the queer pictures and charts in his grandfather's books, while old Whately would instruct and catechize him through long, hushed afternoons.
Use this one for my little hash
The
pipe.
restoration of the house was finished, and those who watched it wondered why one of the upper windows had been made into a solid plank door. It was a window in the rear of the east gable end, close against the hill, and no one could imagine why a fluted wooden runway was built up to it from the ground. About the period of this work's completion, people noticed that the old tool house, tightly locked and windowlessly clapboarded since Wilbur's birth, had been abandoned again. This was open, and when Earl Sawyer stepped within after a cattle-selling call on old Whately, he was quite discomposed by the singular odor he encountered, such a stench he averred as he had never before smelt in all his
Oh yeah,
life,
sure. I'll tell you.
except near the Indian circles on the hills, and which could not come from anything sane or of this earth. But then, the homes and sheds of Dunwich folk have never been remarkable for olfactory immaculateness. The following months were void of visible events, save that everyone swore to a slow but steady increase in the mysterious hill noises. On May Eve of 1915, there were tremors which even the Aylesbury people felt, whilst the following Halloween produced an underground rumbling synchronized with bursts of
I'm slowly getting there.
which Whately ruins
I've got to
on the summit of
actually
Sentinel
put out
Hill.
more content.
Wilbur was growing
It's
up
partly
on
my
the
fault for not
so that
actually
he looked like a boy of 10 as
putting
he
more
was
effort
growing
into it
older.
than,
He read avidly by himself.
or I should put more effort into it than I'm doing.
A settled taciturnity
And I
was
need to put out
absorbing.
more
And for
content.
the first time, people
Just start,
began to speak specifically of the dawning
probably
of
start
cathedral
live
in
streaming
his
a lot more
Irish
gaming.
days. He would sometimes
It's more
mutter
likely to be
unfamiliar jargon,
Diablo
and
2
chant
and Diablo
bizarre
3.
rhythms, which chilled the listener with a sense of unexplainable terror.
And maybe a couple other
The version
ones.
displayed toward him by dogs.
But that's mainly the
without
ones that I like
the
doing,
flag
so
wall.
that or
He was
Assassin's
obliged
Creed.
to carry a pistol in order to traverse the countryside in safety. His occasional use of the weapon did not enhance his popularity amongst the owners of cattle.
Much hours of like that I put into
The quarters of the house would often
Diablo.
alone on
I
the
can do
ground
some pretty
floor,
long,
while odd
pretty
cries and
long
footsteps
live streams when I do
resounded
that.
from the boarded up second story. She would never tell what her father and the boy were doing up there, though once she turned pale and displayed an abnormal degree of fear when a jocose fish peddler tried the locked door.
Bro, I'm
leading to the
almost
stairwell.
halfway there. I'm almost to
The
5.
peddler told the store loungers at Dunwich Village that he thought he heard a horse stamping on that floor above. The loungers reflected, thinking of the door and runway, and of the cattle that so swiftly disappeared. Then they shuddered as they recalled tales of old Whately's youth, and of the strange things that are called out of the earth when a bullock is sacrificed at the proper time to certain heathen gods. It had for some time been noticed that dogs had begun to hate and fear the whole Whately place as violently as they hated and feared young Wilbur personally. In 1917, the war came, and Squire Sawyer Whately, as chairman of the local draft board, had hard work finding a quota of young Dunwich men fit even to be sent to a development camp. The government, alarmed at such signs of wholesale regional decadence, sent several officers and medical experts to investigate, conducting a survey which New England newspaper readers may still recall. It was the publicity attending this investigation that set reporters on the track of the Whateleys and caused the Boston Globe and Arkham Advertiser to print flamboyant Sunday stories of young Wilbur's
What the hell are
precociousness.
they doing in there?
Old
Give me one
Whately's
second,
black
everyone.
magic, the shelves of strange books, the sealed second
These
story
dogs
of
will
the
do
ancient
something
farmhouse,
here.
and the weirdness of the whole region and its hill noises. Wilbur was 4.5 then, and looked like a lad of 15. His lip and cheek were fuzzy with a coarse dark down, and his voice had begun to break. Earl Sawyer went out to the Whately place with both sets of reporters and cameramen, and called their attention to the queer stench which now seemed to trickle down from the sealed upper spaces. It was, he said, exactly like the smell he had found in the tool shed abandoned when the house was finally repaired, and like the faint odors which he sometimes thought he caught near the stone circles on the mountains. Dunwich folk read the stories when they appeared and grinned over the obvious mistakes. They wondered, too, why the writers had made so much of the fact that old Whately always paid for his cattle.
Dogs in there running around, wrestling, and
The Whateleys had received
it's the little one especially was round and running around with the big one.
They did not dare court further publicity.
It wouldn't be that bad if it was the little one, but, or, yeah, the little one, but the big one too.
4. For a decade, the annals of the Whateleys sink indistinguishably into the general life of a morbid community used to their queer ways and hardened to their May Eve and All Hallow orgies. Twice a year, they would light fires on the top of Sentinel Hill, at which times the mountain rumblings would recur with greater and greater violence. While at all seasons, there were strange and portentous doings at the lonely farmhouse. In the course of time, callers professed to hear sounds in the sealed upper story, even when all the family were downstairs. And they wondered how swiftly or how lingeringly a cow or bullock was usually sacrificed. There was talk of a complaint to the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, but nothing ever came of it, since Dunwich folk are never anxious to call the outside world's attention to themselves. About 1923, when Wilbur was a boy of 10, whose mind, voice, stature, and bearded face gave all the impressions of maturity, the second great siege of carpentry went on at the old house. It was all inside the sealed upper part, and from bits of discarded lumber, people concluded that the youth and his grandfather had knocked out all the partitions and even removed the attic floor, leaving only one vast open void between the ground story and the peak roof. They had torn out the great central chimney too, and fitted the rusty range with a flimsy outside tin stove. In the spring after this event, old Whately noticed the growing number of whippoorwills that would come out of Cold Spring Glen to chirp under his window at night. He seemed to regard the circumstance as one of great significance, told the loungers at Osborne's.
So after this live, I might end up doing another one on just some gameplay. Get on either Diablo 2 or 3.
Don't calculate to miss it. You will know, boys, after I'm gone, whether they get me or not.
What's everyone doing tonight?
If they do, they'll keep us singing.
What's everyone smoking on? If you're smoking on anything.
If they don't, they'll kind of quiet down like. I expect them and the soul they hunts for have some pretty tough tussle sometimes. On Lammas night, 1924, Dr. Houghton of Aylesbury was hastily summoned by Wilbur Whately, who had lashed his one remaining horse through the darkness and telephoned from Osborne's in the village. He found old Whately in a very grave state, with a cardiac action and stertorous breathing that told of an end not far off. The shapeless albino daughter and oddly bearded grandson stood by the bedside. Whilst from the vacant abyss overhead, there came no disquieting suggestion of a rhythmical surging or lapping, as of the waves on some level beach. The doctor, though, was chiefly disturbed by the chattering night-birds outside, a seemingly limitless legion of whippoorwills that cried their endless message in repetitions timed diabolically to the wheezing gasps of the dying man. It was uncanny and unnatural. Too much, thought Dr. Howden, like the whole of the region, yet entered so reluctantly in response to the urgent call. Toward 1 o'clock, Lord Whately gained consciousness and interrupted his wheezing to choke out a few words to his grandson. "More space, Willie. More space soon. It grows, and that grows faster. We'll be ready to serve you soon, boy. Open up the gates to Longsalt with the long chant that you'll find on page 751 of the complete edition, and then put a match to the prison. Fire from earth can't burn it nohow." He was obviously quite mad. After a pause, during which the flock of whippoorwills outside adjusted their cries to the altered tempo, while some indications of the strange hill noises came from afar off, he added another sentence or two. "Feed it regular, Willie, and mind the quantity, but don't let it grow too fast for the place. If it busts quarters or gives out before you opens to Longsalt, it's all over and no use. Only them from beyond can make it multiply and work. Only them, the old ones, as wants to come back." The speech gave place to gasps again, and Lavinia screamed at the way the whippoorwills followed the change. It was the same for more than an hour, when the final throaty rattle came. Dr. Howden drew shrunken lids over the glazing gray eyes as the tumult of birds faded imperceptibly to silence. Lavinia sobbed, but Wilbur only chuckled whilst the hill noises rumbled faintly. "They didn't get him," he muttered in his heavy bass voice. Wilbur was by this time a scholar of really tremendous erudition in his one-sided way, and was quietly known by correspondence to many librarians in distant places where rare and forbidden books of old days are kept. He was more and more hated and dreaded around Dunwich because of certain youthful disappearances which suspicion laid vaguely at his door, but was always able to silence inquiry through fear, or through use of that fund of old-time gold which still, as in his grandfather's time, went forth regularly and increasingly for cattle buying. He was now tremendously mature of aspect, and his height, having reached the normal adult limit, seemed inclined to wax beyond that figure. In 1925, when a scholarly correspondent from Miskatonic University called upon him one day and departed pale and puzzled, he was fully 6 3/4 feet tall. Through all the years, Wilbur had treated his half-deformed albino mother with a growing contempt, finally forbidding her to go to the hills with him on May Eve and Hallowmas. And in 1926, the poor creature complained to Lady Bishop of being afraid of him. "There's more about him as I knows than I can tell you, Mamie," she said. "And nowadays, there's more than what I know myself. I vow afore God, I don't know what he wants, nor what he's a-trying to do." That Halloween, the hill noises sounded louder than ever. The fire burned on Sentinel Hill as usual, but people paid more attention to the rhythmical screaming of vast flocks of unnaturally belated whippoorwills, which seemed to be assembled near the unlighted Whately farmhouse. After midnight, their shrill notes burst into a kind of pandemoniac cachinnation, which filled all the countryside, and not until dawn did they finally quiet down. Then they vanished, hurrying southward, where they were fully a month overdue. What this meant, no one could quite be certain till later. None of the country folk seemed to have died. The poor Lavinia Whately, the twisted albino, was never seen again. In the summer of 1927, Wilbur repaired 2 sheds in the farmyard, and began moving his books and effects out to them. Soon afterward, Earl Sawyer told the loungers at Osborne's that more carpentry was going on in the Whately farmhouse. Wilbur was closing all the doors and windows on the ground floor, and seemed to be taking out partitions as he and his grandfather had done upstairs 4 years before. He was living in one of the sheds, and Sawyer thought he seemed unusually worried and tremulous. People generally suspected him of knowing something about his mother's disappearance, and very few ever approached his neighborhood now. His height had increased to more than 7 feet, and showed no signs of ceasing its development. End of part 1. Part 2 of The Dunwich Horror by H.P. Lovecraft. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Dunwich Horror. 5. The following winter brought an event no less strange than Wilbur's first trip outside the Dunwich region. Correspondence with the Widener Library at Harvard, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, the British Museum, the University of Buenos Aires, and the library at Miskatonic University at Arkham had failed to get him the loan of a book he desperately wanted. So at length he set out in person, shabby, dirty, bearded, and uncouth of dialect, to consult the copy at Miskatonic, which was the nearest to him geographically. Almost 8 feet tall and carrying a cheap new valise from Osborne's General Store, this dark and goatish gargoyle appeared one day in Arkham in quest of their dreaded volume kept under lock and key at the college library. The hideous Necronomicon of the mad era Alhazred in Olaus Wormius Latin version, as printed in Spain in the 17th century. He had never seen the city before, but had no thought save to find his way to the university grounds, where, indeed, he passed heedlessly by the great white-fanged watchdog that barked with unnatural fury and enmity and tugged frantically at its stout chain. Wilbur had with him the priceless but imperfect copy of Dr. Dee's English version, which his grandmother had bequeathed him, and upon receiving access to the Latin copy, he at once began to collate the two texts with the aim of discovering a certain passage, which would have come on the 751st page of his own defective volume. This much he could not civilly refrain from telling the librarian, the same erudite Henry Armitage, A.M. Miskatonic, Ph.D. Princeton, Lit.D. Johns Hopkins, who had once called at the farm, and who now politely plied him with questions. He was looking, he had to admit, for a kind of formula or incantation containing the frightful name Yog Sothoth, and it puzzled him to find discrepancies, duplications, and ambiguities which made the matter of determination far from easy. As he copied the formula,
Alright, well, I'm gonna call it into this life for right now. I'll probably get on a little bit later on some Diablos.
In the Latin version contained such monstrous
I want to thank Adam for stopping by, and everyone who keeps stopping by, showing love and support. And hope everyone has a safe Friday evening or Friday night. Until next time, everyone. Hobo's come out.